came to weaving after more than a decade of being a knitter, and after I had already learned how to spin my own yarn. Because of this, I've always felt that yarn is yarn. You experiment with it to see if it's what you want for your project, and if so, you forge ahead. But when I was a new weaver, I remember seeing a lot of experienced weavers shudder when I talked about using knitting yarn as weaving yarn, specifically in the warp. Why was this? Was I missing something? Is there something wrong with using knitting yarn in your warp? After all, there are whole categories of looms, specifically rigid heddle looms, that are marketed to knitters. They're designed specifically to work with knitting yarns, and sometimes they're even called knitters' looms. In this video, I'll talk about the differences between knitting yarns and weaving yarns, and there are some, and we'll talk about what to look out for so you can choose your yarns with confidence, no matter what the label says. Hi, I'm Pamela from Fibersprite.com, and I help fiber artists understand what they really need to know so they can get down to their real passion, actually working with fiber. Would you like to be featured in my film? Come on, Mike!
No.
I'm drinking my delicious tea out of a Moment mug, which has a handle specifically designed for ease of grip. And I'd love to introduce you to the inventor, Mike. You're gonna have to duck and wave.
Hello.
Say hi, Mike.
Hi.
Thanks, Mike.
I hope you're not putting that whole thing in there.
I might put a clip of it in there. It turns out that there are some differences between yarns that are marketed towards knitters and yarns that are marketed towards weavers. For me, the most significant difference is in how the yarn is actually made. Generally, weaving yarns have more twist in them and knitting yarns have less. Less twist allows the yarn to feel softer against the skin, while adding twist adds durability but sacrifices softness. Knitting yarns might also have very low amounts of twist in the single plies, followed by high amounts of twist in the ply twist. What this does is it creates a soft and springy yarn. The extra ply twist gives it a little bit more durability against pilling, but still allows that yarn to feel really soft. The extra ply twist also makes it really springy and elastic, which can cause some issues for weavers, especially if you're putting it into your warp. It might stretch out more than you're expecting and then contract like a spring once it's off the loom, and so what you thought was going to be a scarf is really going to be more like a placemat. On the other hand, high amounts of elasticity are great for knitted garments because it allows them to spring back into shape if they've been stretched out in any way, and it's also a lot easier on your hands or your knitting machine while you're actually going through the knitting process. Knitting yarns aren't just limited to traditional construction methods. There are all kinds of novelty yarns that change with the fashions and seasons. Lately, I've been seeing a lot of chainette yarns, which add thickness to the yarn without adding weight. There are also some chainette yarns that have a soft filling blown in. This allows for extra softness and warmth without being too hot, especially with certain fibers that are known for being extremely warm, like alpaca. A yarn like this is composed of a lot of very thin, fine single-ply yarns that are basically knitted into a tube, and they're not going to stand up very well to abrasion. Typically, ply twist is what makes a yarn capable of standing up to abrasion. So these chainette yarns might not be the best warp yarns, but as always, sample for yourself and find out. In contrast, weaving yarns, even the single ply ones, are spun a little bit tighter than knitting yarns. This keeps the yarn more stable during the weaving process, and it also helps it stand up to abrasion at the loom. And it means that there's going to be less shrinkage once you take it off. Sure, there might be a little bit of shrinkage, and there's always shrinkage in wet finishing, but you'd be surprised how much stretch can happen when a yarn is under tension at the loom. Weaving yarn also tends to be much smoother in texture than knitting yarn. Textured or slubby bits in weaving yarn can get caught on the reed or the heddles, and those will be points that are more likely to break. So while you may see some textured yarns marketed as weaving yarns, even warp yarns, you're not going to see as many of them, and you're definitely not going to see the broad range of novelty yarns in weaving as you do with knitting. You'll probably find that weaving yarns come in a much narrower range of thicknesses than knitting yarns. Weaving yarns are often much finer than a knitting yarn. For example, this is a 3-2 cotton. It's a weaving yarn, and it is called a bulky yarn by most weavers. But if you compare that to a knitting yarn, this is a sock yarn, which is on the finer end of the spectrum of yarns that most hand knitters are willing to knit with. They're actually the same thickness. So in weaving, a bulky yarn is what a fine yarn is in knitting. There are some thicker weaving yarns out there. These are usually rug yarns, and they're usually used as weft and not as warp. This has to do with a lot of factors. One of the biggest ones is just the size of the yarn that your heddles and your reed can accommodate. Knitting yarns, in contrast, are often thicker because thicker yarns work up faster. Thicker yarns make a more satisfyingly squishy garment, and that thicker yarn is a lot easier for most people's hands to work with. One frustration that a lot of people have with knitting yarns is the utter lack of standardization of thicknesses. Sure, there are ranges of thicknesses like lace weight, fingering, DK, worsted, chunky, but even within those are just ranges of thicknesses. It's really hard to pin down similarities between different brands of yarn. One brand's worsted might be another brand's fingering, and yet another brand's chunky yarn. So it's really kind of the wild, wild west when it comes to knitting yarns. And it ultimately has to do with that broad availability of choice. Because knitting yarns have so many different qualities and have so many different ways of being spun, there's just more out there. And it's harder to pin down exact qualities for every single knitting yarn. Weaving yarn, on the other hand, is much more standardized. And there's a standardized system for talking about the weight of your weaving yarn. Yarn weights are typically presented with numbers that indicate the number of plies and how thick the yarn is. Now, this system does get a little bit complicated, and it is a little bit arbitrary because of the numbers that are assigned to yards per pound. But the important thing to know is that the bigger the number indicating the thickness, the yarn is actually going to be thinner because it has more yards per pound. And the smaller the number indicating the thickness, the thicker the yarn will be because there are fewer yards per pound. Put up is a term that indicates how yarn is packaged and sold. Most weaving yarn comes on cones and on tubes. This is a great way to fit a lot of yarn into a fairly small package without worrying about tangling. And when you're ready to use it, it's ready to use. This is great when you're working at the warping board or winding your bobbins. Most knitting yarns, in contrast, are sold in hanks or skeins or balls. This allows knitters to complete easy, quick, single skein projects like socks, mittens, hats, and scarves, or they can buy multiples in different colors or of the same color to make larger projects like blankets and sweaters. When I was doing the research for this video, I thought that weaving yarns would turn out to be a little bit less expensive than knitting yarns. This is what I'd always heard from other weavers, that knitting yarns are more expensive, and that was going to be their excuse for saying that weaving yarn is always better. And we all know that when we go into a yarn store, a single skein of knitting yarn feels affordable, but then when you buy enough for a whole project, it adds up pretty quick. Since weaving yarns are sold in larger quantities, they can feel more expensive up front, but you're actually getting more yardage. In my research, I found that weaving yarns of a similar fiber content and thickness were actually fairly comparable to knitting yarns in price. Weaving yarns were occasionally 10 to 20 cents cheaper per ounce, and this is probably because there's less packaging and labor involved. And yes, that is going to add up to a few dollars saved per project, but it wasn't as significant of a price difference as I expected. It's entirely possible that these prices have evened out due to supply chain issues that arose during the pandemic, but I'm really not sure about this one. As it turns out, in 2023, going into 2024, prices are pretty comparable between weaving yarns and knitting yarns. One big difference between knitting yarns and weaving yarns is selection. Because knitting is the more popular craft, and because there are fewer restrictions on what the yarn needs to be able to accomplish, while it's being one big difference between knitting yarns and weaving yarns is selection. There's a huge range of knitting yarns that are available, from weights, thicknesses, fiber composition, and how could I forget color? There's just a ton out there. There's also more textures and yarn constructions available that can hold up in a knitted garment. In contrast, weaving yarns have a few limitations on them. They need to be able to pass through the loom without breaking or stretching too much. They need to be able to stand up to abrasion. And so there's just a smaller range of yarns available. There's also fewer manufacturers making yarn specifically for weaving. To cope with this, weavers tend to rely on other tricks, like combining different colors, different structures, and different techniques to create the effects that we want to achieve at the loom. I don't often find myself wanting to knit with a weaving yarn, but I do often find myself wanting to weave with a knitting yarn. Remember that any yarn can be good weft, so most of what we're talking about here is for the purpose of comparing warp yarns. I have a whole video about selecting good warp yarns, but what it really comes down to is it needs to be strong enough to hold up to the tension and the abrasion of the loom. Due to their more elastic construction, knitting yarns might have a tendency to stretch when they're warped on a loom. And this might be what caused my more experienced weaver friends to be a little bit concerned with using knitting yarns as warp. Remember that many unexpected effects of any yarn can be anticipated if you remember to sample. When it comes down to it, there are no weaving police. Remember to test your yarns for strength, remember to sample, and enjoy weaving with whatever yarns come your way. If you'd like to dive deeper into the topic of what makes good yarn, be sure and check out my warping yarn video series. It's going to be up here on the screen somewhere, and it's also going to be linked in the description below. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.